Analysis of four Langston Hughes poems, Mother to Son, The Negro Speaks of Rivers, I Too, and Harlem. Mother to Son by Langston Hughes. Well, son, I'll tell you, life for me ain't been no crystal stair. It's had tacks in it, and splinters, and boards torn up, and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. But all the time I's been a-climbin' on and reachin' landin's and turnin' corners, and sometimes goin' in the dark where there ain't been no light. So, boy, don't you turn back, don't you set down on the steps, 'cause you'll find it's kind o' hard. Don't you fall now, for I's still goin', honey, I's still climbin', and life for me ain't been no crystal stair. Analysis of Mother to Son. This is a simple poem spoken by a narrator giving her son advice on how to live life. Her dialect, the details she gives of her life, and the typical content of Langston Hughes's writing tell the reader it is most likely an African-American mother addressing her son. The poem gives an extended metaphor comparing living life to climbing a staircase, and she tells him, "Life for me ain't been no crystal stair," meaning life has been hard. She says her staircase or life has had splinters and tacks in it and boards torn up and places with no carpet on the floor, bare. These details describe a difficult life, which may also at times be lonely or poverty-stricken, as in bare. However, her advice is to not give up, because even when times get tough, as in there ain't been no light, and he might want to give up, she tells him, "Don't you sit down on the steps, 'cause you'll find it's kind of hard." She tells him, despite the hardships of her life, I's still climbin'. Thus the poem is realistic in its portrayal of the difficulties of life, especially for an African American during 1922 when the poem was written, and yet it's hopeful in its assertion that he should not give up, suggesting that at the end of the staircase there might be a reward, perhaps achievements, an improved life, or heaven in the afterlife. The Negro Speaks of Rivers by Langston Hughes. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. Background information on The Negro Speaks of Rivers. The Negro Speaks of Rivers was composed in 1920 on a train ride Langston Hughes took on the way to visit his father in Mexico when he was 18 years old, and was published a year later in the literary magazine Crisis. Hughes was crossing the Mississippi River near St. Louis when he saw the sun glimmering off the great river. He began to think about what the Mississippi River meant to the African American people who were often taken south on the river during the days of slavery and then sold. He also thought about how he had read that Abraham Lincoln had taken a raft down the Mississippi River to New Orleans and was horrified by the sight of human beings being bought and sold as slaves, and how this experience influenced Lincoln to later sign the Emancipation Proclamation, which ended legal slavery. Hughes also had thoughts about how the river seemed to connect him with his people throughout the ages, and so he wrote the poem on the back of his father's letter. The poem was dedicated to W.E.B. Du Bois, a fellow African-American writer and civil rights leader whom Hughes feels a connection to. Analysis of The Negro Speaks of Rivers. In this poem, Hughes compares rivers to the flow of blood through the veins of humans, and then uses several allusions to historical African-American events that connect him with his ancestors. He shows the connection to his people across time and geographic space by using the pronoun I to refer to the experiences that his people have had, as if he himself has shared them as well. He says, I bathed in the Euphrates, I built my hut near the Congo, I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it, and I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans. Hughes uses allusions to different rivers that his African-American ancestors lived along to show their connection through blood, which he compares to the rivers. He also shows the endurance of his people since the beginning of recorded history through the allusions he gives. The poem shows black unity and pride in their African ancestry and suggests hope for the future when he says the muddy bosom of the Mississippi turns all golden in the sunset. I Too by Langston Hughes. I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then. Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed. I too am America. Analysis of I Too. This is a simple but powerful poem in which Langston Hughes uses a defiant tone to denounce racism, and yet also suggests an optimistic hope for an improvement in race relations in the future. As in The Negro Speaks of Rivers, Hughes uses the universal pronoun I to refer not just to himself but to all African American people. He defiantly states that African Americans are also part of America when he begins the poem with I too sing America and ends with I too am America. He calls himself the darker brother and illustrates the current level of acceptable racism during the time of legal segregation when the poem was written, when he says, "They," meaning white people, "send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes." However, he refuses to let this bring him down, as he says, "But I laugh and eat well and grow strong." He shows that he will be patient because in the near future, which he calls tomorrow, segregation will end, and he says at that time, "I'll sit at the table when company comes," and furthermore he adds, "Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen then." He shows his pride in his heritage and in all African Americans when he says, "Besides, they'll see how beautiful I am and be ashamed." Hughes is very accurately forecasting the end of segregation and denouncing the injustice of treating black Americans like second-class citizens in this poem. Harlem by Langston Hughes. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? Analysis of Harlem. This poem, written in 1951, shows Hughes' growing impatience with the slow pace of the civil rights movement. The Civil Rights Act did not pass until 1964, decades after the civil rights movement began in this country. Unlike his earlier poems, the tone of this poem becomes more caustic and angry, paralleling the growing frustration among African Americans who waited almost 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation to achieve true legal equality. In the poem Harlem, which was originally titled A Dream Deferred, he asks the question, what happens to a dream deferred? The choice of changing the title to Harlem makes it clear that Hughes is asking this question in reference to African Americans in particular, as Harlem is a predominantly black neighborhood in New York City, which by the time of the poem had become a ghetto beset with poverty as a result of racial discrimination. The word deferred means postponed or delayed. Thus, one interpretation of Hughes's question is that he means what happens when the dream of desegregation and racial equality are postponed or delayed. His answers use metaphor and simile to describe the possibilities of what may happen in the black community if their dreams continue to be deferred. He says the dreams may just dry up, meaning people may no longer dream. Fester like a sore, meaning they may become resentful. Stink like rotten meat, meaning they will be angry and embittered. Crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet, meaning they will smile and pretend they are okay when they are not. Or just sag like a heavy load, meaning they will end up depressed. He ends the poem with what could be interpreted as a threat by asking, or does it explode? The use of italics emphasizes this possibility, and society could take this as a warning that the continued denial of equality to the African American public could result in pushing people to violence or destructive actions.